Hey everybody, I've got a riddle for you. Who is the most filmed character in film history? Anyone have a clue? It's Dracula. But number 2 is Sherlock Holmes, which you probably guessed from the name of this podcast today. What you may not know is the largest collection of Sherlock Holmes ephemera, of all Sherlock Holmes books, assorted things, anything like that, is actually held at the University of Minnesota. So today I brought on for you today the curator of that collection, my very good friend Tim Johnson, who is the curator of the Sherlock Holmes collection at the University of Minnesota Collections. He's one of the foremost experts in all things Sherlock Holmes in the entire world. So getting Tim to come on today was a bonus, not only because he's my buddy, but also because he's absolute encyclopedia of knowledge when it comes to not only this film, but all the Sherlock Holmes films, the TV shows, the books, the comics, the series, anything like that. So today we're going to jump into the 2009 Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes film, the one with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law. And we have the best freaking time talking about this movie. And I think you're really going to dig not only listening to us talk about the film, but also the process of collecting these massive collections and what it's like to go out and seek out and to actually create a historic collection in a museum or in a library. And that's exactly what Tim and I get into today. So we really get into not only the film, but also the process of actually creating an archive, which is really, really cool. Tim, I think, is really the first librarian we've had on here, or practicing librarian. Alexis Coe was a librarian or an archivist for a while as well. I think you guys are going to really dig this podcast. Hanging out with Tim is always the coolest thing. As I'm talking to you right now, I'm getting ready to go meet him here in a couple days. He's down here in Colorado. This is such a cool podcast. I hope you guys dig it. Tim is such a great dude. You guys should absolutely know him. You can find him on Twitter, on X, whatever, at UMN Bookworm. He's the best dude. This is the best conversation. I hope you guys dig it. So sit back and relax. Sherlock Holmes is next on Historians to the Movies podcast. Tim Johnson, what's going on, buddy? How are you?
Oh, man, I'm doing well. I'm sitting here looking out my backyard window here. It's 82 degrees. I'm thinking, be a great afternoon to hook up the boat, go out to the lake, cast a few lines. That day will come. I mean, we've got some more fishing that we can get in here, but yeah, no, it's absolutely beautiful right now.
And you're in Minnesota right now, right?
Yeah, I am. Yep.
Land of 10,000 lakes. I have to ask you first off, is that complete bullshit or what? Because some of those lakes are like drainage ponds.
That may be the case in Wisconsin. Not in Minnesota. I'll throw a little shade. Yeah.
You're throwing shade across the St. Croix already? We're already banned in Indiana. Okay. You know what? Wisconsin, your cheese isn't good either. How's that?
Oh, no. Hey, I do like Wisconsin cheese. And I did spend some years growing up there in a Milwaukee suburb, so I can't be too cruel. But they have different ways to figure out what's a lake in Wisconsin versus what's a lake in Minnesota. And I think Minnesota is more realistic. And I think the count is 11,000 something on the number of lakes. Yeah, so it's more than 10,000. It's a real deal.
Are Wisconsinites confused because they're all a bunch of drunks? Go ahead and put that on the record.
I have seen a number of things pop up online about the drinking habits of our neighbors to the east, but I'm just going to leave it there.
Doesn't Wisconsin lead the country?
I think they do
per capita,
yeah.
Right?
I think they do. Yeah.
Did you ever see Love Actually?
Yeah.
When the young British chap decides to go to America, he goes to Wisconsin and he orders some Budweiser.
They do a mean Oktoberfest. I will give them that. I'm not gonna dump on them too much because there's some good folks there. But we have our differences. We have our border battles. We have Bucky and we have Goldie. And
I don't know why everything in the Big Ten is named after a burrowing animal, but except for Ohio State, and they're like, we're the fighting acorns. Don't eat us. You might die. I mean, you might die in Ohio anyway, because that's the Florida of the Midwest.
Yeah, the Ohio State, the Yule Gibbons of the Big Ten. I don't know if that reference will hit with anybody.
Not even me. I just let it fly around. I was like, yeah, Gibbons. Well, okay, now you're gonna have to explain.
And I'm digging deep here in the memory banks, but Yule Gibbons was a guy who promoted a lot of natural foods way back in probably the 70s. And he had some line or some jingle along with his promotion, but he became identified with this kind of healthy eating, and to the point of, is a guy eating bark off a tree kind of thing to get that roughage in.
Was this like during the 70s environmentalist movement when we started to see
Yeah,
all the commercials? Like,
I think
there was that one guy who was pretending he was like native, and I think his name was like Iron Eye something or another. I forget his name. If it's wrong, Fletcher will just edit this out.
with the
tear, right? With all the trash and all that stuff, and then people in Ohio are eating trees, which, by the way, is probably better than food in Ohio. Has anyone ever? If you've ever been to Cleveland, it's not that great. I shouldn't say that.
I've been to Columbus. I'm going to try to get to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for the National Council for History Education. That's when their next annual conference is. So
really?
I'd like to. But my experience is I went to Columbus because they were hosting a Sherlock exhibit at the Science Museum there, and I had a little extra time on my hands, so I put all my gopher gear on and walked around the horseshoe at Ohio State. Just nobody accosted me. I was civil, but I just laid a gopher track around that football stadium.
Maybe it was hockey season because that's when Minnesota. Well, we finished second last year. Remember, I think I was talking to you as we were making the run. For people who don't know, you're at University of Minnesota, so that's how you and I come to know each other.
Yeah, well, my official title at the University of Minnesota is Curator of Special Collections and Rare Books, and I am also the E.W. McDermott Curator of the Sherlock Holmes collections, which is the world's largest gathering of material related to Sherlock Holmes, not in London, but in Minneapolis.
No.
I also did one of my grad degrees is from the U in library science back in the day. And I've been here this is my 26th year as curator in the Department of Archives and Special Collections. So my history connection is I've got an undergrad in history from a very nice small school in Chicago called North Park University, founded by some Swedish immigrants on the north side.
Chicago. Love it.
Yeah, I think it's my favorite big city, and we lived there for, well, I think cumulatively about 20 years. And then while I was working there, I came back to North Park after working at a small Catholic college in Lake Forest, a northern suburb. But at North Park, I was also the director of archives for almost 12 years. And while I was there, I found out I could do another grad degree for basically free. So I did a Master of Arts in Theological Studies, which was a focus in church history. So I have an interest in these Swedes who landed in the upper Midwest, and especially where their clergy were trained and where they served. So my thesis for that degree was basically a biographical dictionary of the first 50 years of the ministerium in the Covenant Church.
Oh wow!
So it was a fun project. I mean, as archivist, that was one of the questions I often got was, where did this particular guy serve? Where did he go to school? What kind of training did he receive? And I figured, well, why not, instead of going to the reference cards and the archives all the time, just pull it all together in one big volume. So that's what I did.
I was kind of wondering, because when you said one of your graduate degrees, I was wondering if you're doing the traditional Minnesota thing where you just say, no, I've got 10,000 master's degrees. Some of them are large and some of them are quite small. Some are quite impressive, eh? So, yeah,
well,
I got them.
When I was working in Lake Forest, I had a dinner one night with some of the English faculty, and just the way I was talking and the way I said Minnesota,
Oh
That
yeah.
was a giveaway, But I did spend a couple years in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan too, which is a whole other world up there. Beautiful country, but when I was there, it was economically depressed. The mines had shut down, a lot of people out of work. But it was a good time for me because I was up there after college. I didn't know what I was going to do with an undergrad degree in history. Do I go to grad school? Do I get certified to
Start
teach
a
K
podcast,
12?
Tim.
Yeah, well, this was back in the dark ages. There were no
Oh, come
podcasts
on.
back. You're talking to a guy who saved his first programs on paper tape. So, I'm a bit of an antique myself.
Can you imagine if Martin Luther had a podcast? Like,
There'd be ink pots flying all over the place.
how much trouble would Martin Luther have gotten into if he'd had 99 theses? No, 99 episodes. Let's go,
Yeah, that would be a trip. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So anyway, that's
yeah.
that's a little bit about me. I am a Minnesota native. I was born here. My wife was born here.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, my wife and my dad were born in the same hospital in a little town, better known for as the home of Charles Lindbergh, Little Falls, Minnesota.
Where's that?
It's about 2 hours north and a little bit west of the Twin Cities. It's on the Mississippi River. It's a beautiful little place. And Lindbergh's house is still there, and they've turned that into a museum, and they've got a beautiful visitor center, and it's a state park, so some good camping and hiking there. But like I said, I've spent some time in Chicago, high school days in Colorado, which is where I learned how to ski and mountain climb and do all those kinds of crazy things. And my connection with you in Florida too is when I was a kid. I mean, when you're a preacher's kid, you tend to move around a little bit. But I was in Florida during the early days of the space program. So I'd sit in my front yard outside Lake Worth, West Palm Beach area, watch the rockets go up, and then run inside and listen to Walter Cronkite because it was wall-to-wall coverage back in those days. So yeah, Gemini, Mercury, Gemini, and early Apollo. Which kind of got me tuned into space. And actually, my original plan in college was to study math and become an astronomer or an astrophysicist. But fortunately or unfortunately, I had a class with a really talented professor who had been probably a minor figure in the Manhattan Project, but for whatever reason, I didn't see the challenge in mathematics, and I wanted something that had a little more variability, and decided to switch to a history degree instead of mathematics. And so here I am.
No, it's insane when you and I got to know each other, especially after I moved down to Colorado, because it felt like we've just been crossing paths. Like I've been retracing the Tim Johnson diaspora for the last some odd years. Lake Worth is home to my favorite restaurant in the world. It wasn't there when you were there. It's called Havana, and it's this Cuban restaurant in like Lake Worth, right off Forest Hill Boulevard. It is my I just made masita de puerco frita the other day. Whenever I try to like cook food, like Cuban food, I'm like trying to embody them.
Mm-hmm.
Plus this great cookbook called Clarita's Cocina, which is this like very traditional Cuban cookbook that like everybody in the world knows.
I'm blanking on the name all of a sudden, but there's a nice little Cuban cafe which you may have frequented since it's South Minneapolis, and Theo Stavru from the history department.
Mm-hmm.
Stavru's, I think it's Stavru's daughter owns it, and he's got a special booth. I mean, it's a tiny little place. When I was in grad school, it wasn't a Cuban restaurant. It was a little breakfast place with a wood-burning stove, and it was kind of where we hung out on Saturday mornings.
No,
Yeah.
So when I was in Minneapolis and whenever I came to know you, I didn't get a chance to eat at like any places, like even that Cuban restaurant, because I was a thing called poor, because that's how much University of Minnesota pays its graduate students. University of Minnesota graduate students cannot afford meals at a rice-based cuisine. That's how little they pay their graduate students.
Yeah. it's sadly it's true. I mean, we deal with student food insecurity
Oh yeah.
all the time. I mean, we've got students working for us in the libraries as undergrads, and we've started a food pantry just to try to help out a bit because it's not good.
It's not a little bit sad. It's a lot sad. And there's,
Yeah.
I would say that for any graduate students who are listening or people who are thinking about going into graduate school, the lack of pay is a real thing because what I ended up having to do was not only, I had a stipend and I think my stipend was like $19,000 a year when I was there, which is awesome when you're 38 and going through a divorce. And I ended up having to take out student loans just so I could afford to fly back and forth to see my kids. It's not a living wage. And then,
No.
And the frustrating thing is because when you're in graduate school, I don't know that a lot of people know for historians just how much work is in. I mean, it was just every day, 7 days a week, go to class, teach the classes you're teaching, and then read. And read and read and read and write and think and pass out from, I'm talking sheer exhaustion. And then for those people smart enough, and I'm not one of them, that could actually do this kind of work and have some time to do other things, there was and I think a lot of schools are like this, they actually prohibit their graduate school students from having jobs. So it's the economic troubles of graduate students it's tough. I mean, yeah. I don't know how. I know how to fix it. It's called give them more money.
Well, and the difference between when I was in grad school and when you were in grad school at the U, and granted, I wasn't doing a PhD, although that thought did cross my mind. But
I got the sympathy PhD. I got the we're tired of you being at the University of Minnesota. It's been great. We know you like it. You've got the swag. Please leave. PhD is what I got.
Yeah, when I was in grad school, and this is early 80s, and the economy was crazy. Interest rates were 20%. And, I was working, I had 2 jobs in the library, each half time. So that's 40 hours. And I was going to class, and I was driving a school bus. So I was getting up at 4:30 in the morning on a cold winter morning and picking up kids in Apple Valley and bringing them into Minneapolis, and then doing the same thing in the afternoon. I mean, I don't know how I survived, but I do know it was a lot cheaper, just the bills, because my grad school loan was $5,000, and I used half of it for one summer trip in Sweden. I spent the summer in Sweden, and the other half paid my grad school. Well, and all the work I was doing too. But the amount of funding that the state used to provide to the university as opposed to what it is today, I mean, it's criminal, when we're in single digit, percentages of how much, can you really call it a public institution if the public's not putting their money into it and everything that's driving the university is coming in through other channels, whether it's grants or patents or you name it.
There's a real jackass down in Mississippi, and I'm told there's more than one, but his name is Shad White, and he is the auditor. I just became aware of him through some other friends of mine who just hate his guts now. I'm not going to name drop that person but they knew who they are, who alerted me to him. But this guy's a state auditor for the state of Mississippi, and his entire thing is he's got these huge fucking ears that are bigger than the headset that I'm wearing right now, but his whole shtick is about how university students in the state of Mississippi, which look, it's easy to bag on Mississippi. It's actually a beautiful place with terrific people, including our late Jimmy Buffett. And his whole thing is students should only be taking taxpayer dollars to learn skills at the university that will benefit the economy. And it's complete crap for a few different reasons. First and foremost, that's not the point of a university. University is to enrich the lives, and not every subject should be about economic benefit. And then secondly, you're talking about the economy of Mississippi, so people aren't funding, and taxpayers are not funding students like they used to. Federal government used to pay for a lot of these universities, then they pushed it off to the states, and then the states, because they can't run a deficit, push those costs onto students, and then that's how you get this huge student loan crisis that we've got. But
That's how we get West Virginia.
It's tragedy. I see West Virginia. I don't know anybody on the faculty at West Virginia, but I've seen the outcry over at Twitter, and
I'm glad you're still calling it that, because it'll never be X for me.
It's about to be ejected, is what it's about to be. Because if Elon starts saying it's time to pay, I'm heading to blue sky.
I'm
full
gone.
time.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't want to port this whole thing over there, but I will. I got a couple more little questions before we actually get to the movie. People are like, are you going to talk about the movie? Maybe. Maybe that's the mystery of today's podcast. Will we talk about Sherlock Holmes? I don't know.
It's elementary. Yeah.
All right. So you're an archivist. Are you also a librarian?
I am. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing there is I was trained as an archivist in a traditional library science program. And so the first archives position that I interviewed for, the consultants to the search committee were the university archivist for Northwestern University, a beautiful guy by the name of Pat Quinn, and Archie Motley from what was then called the Chicago Historical Society. And Archie is a saint in the archival world, and sadly no longer with us. But Patrick especially raised objections to my candidacy as an archivist, because I had not come up through what he thought was the traditional way that archivists are trained through history programs. And I had to point out to him that all of the archives courses I took were through the history department at the University of Minnesota, and they were taught by people who had been president of the Society of American Archivists, who were fellows of the Society of American Archivists. I mean, I had pretty good credentials for the people I was learning from, but because I'd come up through a traditional MLS program, nah, you're not an archivist. You're a librarian. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing or whatever. But I'm a librarian. Once a librarian, always a librarian, and I'm an archivist, and I've got this curator tag as part of my job title. So that's a little bit of a different gig, because I didn't do exhibits till I came to the U, not really. And I think that's where the curatorial part comes in, that links me to some of my colleagues in the museum world.
I want so much to be bitter, angry historian who hates librarians. I've been trying to make that my new shtick about we're anti-librarian here. I think people
you'd be sunk without us.
Well, I think my long librarian history here. So Tim,
yeah, I do. I'm not
heart too. So,
I'm not going to go there.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. So back to this movie podcast. All right. So you said something.
You got one more.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The Coke versus Pepsi. What are you? Okay. Oh, is that a fresh Coca-Cola, or is that one from hanging around from last year?
This one's been in the fridge for a while. So, but I don't know what aged Coke might taste like, but I pulled it out because I knew that it was going to come up. So,
it's definitely going to come up. Well, you can. Okay, so Coca-Cola in a can will hold its carbonation for a long time.
All right,
but in a bottle, it won't. It loses carbonation over time. So, I've instructed people when they go to get me a Coke, like a bottle of Coke, it's got to have an expiration date of at least 2 months from the current day, or I won't drink it. Otherwise, it loses carbonation.
Mexican Coke or
Mexican Coke is the truth in life. A cold Mexican Coke and a bag of peanuts.
I will admit I've not done the Coke peanut thing, but you got me thinking about it. So
I did that. I did that in a workshop, in the Native Studies workshop at Minnesota one time. And of course, everybody at the Native workshop, except for me, is from the Great Plains. And they looked at me like I had two heads, which, as I came to realize, was pretty much the way they always looked at me in the Native Studies workshop at Minnesota. So, yeah, but at least I had Coke and peanuts that day. So that's fine. All right. So here's a question. How does the University of Minnesota come to have the largest Sherlock Holmes collection in the world? What is going on with that?
It's in some ways a series of, fortunate accidents. And it goes back to a lunch that 5 faculty members had at the campus club in 1947, where over lunch they discovered they had a shared interest in Sherlock Holmes. And it's like, okay, what are we going to do about this? Well, long story short, they founded a local branch of the Baker Street Irregulars, which is the kind of mother organization of Sherlockians, and had their first meeting on a very cold January in 1948, and they've been going strong ever since. And those five guys who had that lunch, one of those names will be familiar to you, coming out of UMN history, and that's Theodore Blagan
No
of
kidding.
Blagan Hall. He was one of the
Yeah.
founders, along with E.W. McDermott, who was the university librarian. He was also the dean of what was then called the College of Science, Literature, and the Arts, now CLA. He was the dean of the graduate school. There were a couple of chemists at that lunch. Bryce Crawford, who was an expert in rocket propellants, and Wallace Armstrong, who did a lot of research on fluoride. And who am I blanking out? E.Z. Zebarth, who was in communications and was very instrumental in the early days of TV and radio in the Twin Cities, and I think also did a stint as interim university president. So these 5 guys, they get together, they form this group, which in Sherlockian tradition, you have to pick a name that somehow links to the canon, the 60 stories. I don't know who came up with a name, but my leading candidate is Blagan, because the name of the group is called the Norwegian Explorers of Minnesota. Blagan's academic interest was in Norwegian and Norwegian American history. So, and given the makeup of this state with all these Scandinavians, including my forebears, it's not a surprise that they picked that name. Now, you got to jump ahead then to the 70s. E.W. McDermott, by this time, he's a faculty member in the library school. He's nearing retirement. He's volunteering in special collections and rare books. And I think he whispers in the ear of my predecessor, Austin McLean, wouldn't it be nice if the university had a collection of first editions of the Sherlock Holmes stories? And they actually go out and find a collection that's for sale from a guy named James Araldi, who's a Baker Street irregular, I think a hotel musician in New York City. For whatever reason, he's getting rid of his book collection. The university buys it in 1974. That's the beginning of the Sherlock Holmes collection. Now, jump ahead 4 more years to 1978. There was a guy who was very active in the Norwegian explorers. He and his wife were active. His name was Philip Hench, and his wife was Mary Kaler Hench. Philip had actually died in 65, but in 1978, Mary decided to donate their collection of Sherlockiana to the university. Now, Philip also was a co-winner of the 1950 Nobel Prize in Medicine. And if you've ever had a cortisone shot, you can thank Dr. Philip Hench of the Mayo Clinic. So, the Hench collection, though, is absolutely fabulous. It had lots of original material, artwork, manuscripts, rare first editions, 4 copies of the very first time a Sherlock Holmes story appeared in print. And there are only, I think, 31 or 32 copies still in existence of that particular volume called the Beaton's Christmas Annual from 1887. The Henches had 4 of them. So Mary donates the collection to the U in 78, and all of a sudden the Sherlockian world kind of sits up and takes notice, and it's like, what's going on in Minneapolis? And one of the guys who decides to come and visit happens to have the largest private collection at the time. And this was a guy by the name of John Bennett Shaw. He was a really interesting character, an entrepreneur, lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In his retirement, moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, had to add another room onto his house to house his collection because the books were 3 deep on the shelves. But he collected anything and everything that had to do with Sherlock. The traditional stuff in books and paper, but also the restaurant menus, the board games, the jigsaw puzzles, the stuffed animals, the beer mugs, you name it. If it had any connection with Sherlock, Shaw had it in his collection. And he came to the U to look at the Hench collection. And the university did something. We're not always known for doing clever things, but we did a couple clever things with John Bennett Shaw. One is somehow we got the regents to name him a special research fellow. and invited him to give some lectures on Sherlock Holmes at the U, which he did, and which you can listen to online. We digitized some of those recordings. The other thing they did is they started talking to him about what was going to happen to his collection. Now, he had no association with the U. He was a Notre Dame graduate. He'd already given his G.K. Chesterton collection to Notre Dame. But for whatever reason, he saw how well kept and promoted and used the other collections, the Hench collection and Inveraldi were. And through a series of conversations, the university and John Bennett Shaw came to an agreement that his collection was going to come to the U after he died. Now, he later changed that and said it could come before he died. And so in 1993, a whole bunch of semi trucks pulled up to his house in Santa Fe and loaded it all up and brought it here. And that literally put us over the top and made us the world's largest collection. Now, on top of that, Shaw became an ambassador and started twisting the arms of some of his friends and said, my collection's coming to Minnesota. I think yours should too. An example there is a good friend of his was a woman by the name of Edith Meiser. Edith Meiser was an actor, a writer. She had done a lot of the Sherlock radio plays. She had done the scripts in the 30s and 40s. And the thing is, she had never turned over those rights to any of the networks. So she still had all of her original scripts, plus she had these big 16-inch transcription disc recordings of the shows. And in 1991, thanks to some lobbying on John Bennett Shaw's part and also some of the Norwegian explorers, Edith's collection came to Minnesota. And it just kept, the Shaw collection kind of created this, the Shaw and Hench together created this gravitational field that just started to pull other things.
This is so cool.
And that has continued. You get this critical mass and people see how it's cared for, how it's displayed in exhibitions, how it's used in the classroom, all these things. And it's like, okay, I want my collection to come to Minnesota too. Now, there are some other great collections. I mean, there's a beautiful Holmes collection in London.
They're not in Wisconsin, are they?
No.
That's right.
No.
Go on.
Not going to go there. No. North Carolina, I think, has a nice little Holmes collection. There's an Arthur Conan Doyle collection at the Public Library in Toronto, which is world class. So there are others out there. It's just this magical combination of, the Henches collecting what we might call the high points, the really rare and special kinds of art and manuscripts, and the vacuum cleaner approach of John Bennett Shaw, just sweeping in everything. Those two in combination created this beautiful kind of thing. And what I like to think of is, in some ways, the collection didn't come about at all by any of the curators. This is a community effort from the Sherlockians, who saw value in bringing things together in a place that in turn could be shared and now digitized and made accessible in all kinds of exciting ways. So it's really a community effort that came out of these happy accidents that has created this wonderful, beautiful thing, and the community that surrounds it. I love the researchers who come in. Interestingly, the biggest battle I've had is maybe with getting somebody in English to champion Arthur Conan Doyle as an author of note, because they're dealing with Shakespeare and all the big names in English literature, and Doyle in some ways is second tier. But occasionally there's a course on detective fiction, or there's Victorian studies or popular culture, and we can plug into that. And and it's not only the U. I've got a good friend who teaches at St. Thomas, and she brings her students, both undergrad and grad, over to do course presentations and stuff. So we spread the word, we get the gospel out. And then for me, the other fun thing is there are a lot of adult learning groups. The university has connected with the Osher Lifelong Learning Program, and some of these other communities like Rochester and up some places farther north, Park Rapids and Bemidji, have adult learning things. And we've taken it on the road and gone up and done presentations, and I love the interaction with adult learners. They are so into the stories and into the whole kind of Sherlockian universe.
Well, that's what I want to get into today, because we chose 2009's Robert Downey Jr., Jude Law, Sherlock Holmes film,
Sherlock
Guy
Holmes,
Ritchie
yep.
directed, right? There's no shortage all the way to this day of Sherlock Holmes universe type stuff. And that part of what we'll talk about a little bit later on is Sherlock Holmes through the years, portrayals in film or media, and things like that, your favorite performances and things like that. I thought maybe this particular film is maybe a little bit more accessible to audiences. It's more recent. We've seen him more recently on the Enola Holmes series, which has been on Netflix, which I thought was actually a lot of fun. We've done both of those films, as well as this one on HATM. So I guess maybe let's just jump in here to this movie now that we're 40 minutes into our conversation about the movie. What are your thoughts on this movie? This is a different take on Sherlock Holmes that we'd seen before. This is, you've got Guy Ritchie making this film, so it's got a style, it's got a flavor to it. I think the big thing you have to address right off the bat is, wait, there's an American playing Sherlock Holmes? What's your thoughts on Robert Downey Jr. as Sherlock Holmes in this film?
My first reaction when I first saw it, and I don't know how I'm kind of a big tent guy, so I tend to like most everything that's Sherlock, although we'll maybe get into some that I haven't seen yet. But my first reaction was, and I think this was the reaction of kind of the traditional Sherlockian, the devotee, this was Sherlock Holmes meets Iron Man. This was a Sherlock Holmes superhero. But when you read the stories, what's often overlooked and what Guy Ritchie picks up on is the physicality of Holmes. This is a guy who knows martial arts, who's a stick fighter. He's a boxer. I mean, these things are not foreign to him. So part of my appreciation for what Robert Downey Jr. does and what Guy Ritchie does, because we have this Holmes-a-vision where, it happens right early in the film where you get the deductions, the analysis of the encounter, and then it all happens, after going through the slow motion kind of Holmes-a-vision that Guy Ritchie comes up with. And so I don't have really any objection to Robert Downey Jr. in the role, except to say, when you look at the original canon, and all the films pretty much fail on this point, TV shows maybe less so, but what people fail to recognize is Holmes is starting this career pretty much right out of university. In fact, we don't even know whether he's an Oxford man or a Cambridge man, or whether he was rusticated, sent down, whether he even got a degree. But the adventures, this is a young man's adventure story, and everybody gets cast. They're all older, but okay, so set that aside as it may be a minor objection. What I also look at is what's the chemistry between Holmes and Watson? Because in my mind, this is one of the great literary pairings of all time, where the way these two meet, for me, kind of the umbrella way I understand and look at all the Holmes stuff is it's a study in friendship, how these two guys get along, and the chemistry works spectacularly, I think, with Guy Ritchie and Jude Law. I mean, Jude Law is he or Martin Freeman, maybe my favorite Watsons. And again, you've got to put it in historical context. Watson is he's an army surgeon. He's been in Afghanistan. He's been wounded. And again, that's maybe a young man's story. It's not the Nigel Bruce that you get in the Basil Rathbone films, a much older Watson. This is a guy who's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And, maybe that doesn't come out so much in Jude Law's portrayal, but the chemistry is magical. And I love how those two interact in this movie and in the other one, Game of Shadows from 2011.
Yeah, for me, coming out of my generation, it was understanding Sherlock Holmes through the lens of the Great Mouse Detective. Growing up, but I understood absolutely. But I understand. I think I always understood. And I think a lot of audiences of, say, Generation X, maybe even elder millennials, understood Watson as the bumbling sidekick, and that's certainly not who he is. It's not who he is in the books, right? And he's certainly not that way in these films.
He's not bumbling. I mean, I think Holmes at one point calls Watson a conductor of light. And there are a few instances where Holmes puts Watson to the test to do his own deductions. And invariably, Watson gets it all wrong. But even in getting it wrong, he's illuminating something that Holmes might not have seen. So, the pairing works when you have these two interacting and doing the deductive work or the inductive work, the logic, the close study of a particular scene or whatever. But yeah, the interesting thing too is that, I mean, amongst some Sherlockians, Nigel Bruce has the nickname Bubis Britannicus because he in some ways he is this comic sidekick to Holmes, but not always. You know, I think even in the Rathbone, and I think they did 14 films together, Rathbone and Bruce, and Holmes, by the way, according to Guinness Book of World Records, is the most filmed living literary character in the world. There have been more actors who have portrayed Holmes than anybody else. Now, Guinness also qualifies that. You notice I use the phrase living literary character. The one who beats him out is a creation of one of Conan Doyle's friends, Bram Stoker, who did Dracula, who is actually the most filmed literary character.
Wow.
But the range of people who have played Holmes over the years, you know, the Leonard Nimoys, the Roger Moores, the Dudley Moores, the Will Ferrells.
We'll have to talk about the Will
But
Ferrell.
we'll talk about him later. Let's stick with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law right now because that pairing works. And I think for Robert, not knowing him, although a Sherlockian friend of mine does know him and was a consultant on the second film, Les Klinger, I think maybe one of the challenges for Robert in the character, and you see this in the first film, is coming up with British English. And not only British English, but Victorian British English. You know, he speaks about an innovative bridge design, and there are a few other pronunciations that he throws in there. So I think just as an actor, whoever was his dialogue coach or whatever did a good job, I think.
Well, I mean, it helps that you've got Robert Downey Jr. as this role, right? Because did you see him in Oppenheimer?
Oh,
he's phenomenal.
Oppenheimer. and what a person to play in that film. I mean, Oppenheimer's nemesis.
He's so good.
I had to do a double take first. You know, I knew it was him playing Strauss, but still, I think it gets intense, more intense as the film goes on. But sometime we're going to talk about Oppenheimer because for me that's been one of the more amazing movies I've seen in a long time, with just so many layers and just I thought exquisitely done. You know, but he's a great actor.
Well, that's what makes this movie worse, right? Because you've got a slew of really talented people in these roles. Some of the other people I want to talk to you about, because I don't know as much about them. Most notably, we don't see Moriarty in this film. We hear about him, right? Which I think is, I don't know what your thoughts are. I think I liked that they didn't just lead with Moriarty.
Right.
You build to the arch nemesis, don't you?
Which is, and that's true to the canon too, because Moriarty, of the 60 stories, I think there are 2 or 3 or 4 times that Moriarty is either mentioned or appears. So he, in many ways, is a minor character given the whole canon. And yeah, the fact that they play him in the shadows in this film, all you hear is the voice, or you see a particular device of his and a little bit of chalk on his coat, which is another clue. So yeah, it works. I think the challenge between the first film and the second film was matching up the voice with the actor who plays Moriarty, where he does appear in Game of Shadows, Jared Harris.
Jared Harris is so great. I actually loved him as Grant in the Lincoln film. Even though he didn't look like Grant, he felt like Grant. Felt like I imagined Grant. He's just good. But give him a cigar to chomp on. I'm a huge. I loved him in Mad Men. I love Jared Harris. I think he's terrific.
Yeah.
I know there was some talk about making Brad Pitt Moriarty for the second film.
No.
But Harris works.
Yeah, Harris definitely works. Yeah.
What about Blackwood? Is Blackwood a character in the Sherlock Holmes world, or is he kind of created for this? Because Mark Strong feels right.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Strong, I don't believe there's a Blackwood in the original canon. So I think this is a creation of the writers and for this script. But he works.
Well, I guess the question I've got for you is, in a film like this, do you think that there's a necessity to only have your classic Arthur Conan Doyle characters, or is it okay to branch out and kind of create these new guys who are maybe in the spirit of the Doylean world? I don't know, how Doyle-esque world?
I think it's totally fair to do that. And interestingly, it happens almost immediately when the stories first appear in the 1880s, 1890s. People are writing parodies and pastiches, and they're doing spin-offs of the character and maybe introducing new characters that fit in with that
There's
particular.
fanfic.
Yeah, it's fanfic, exactly. So no problem creating that character or the midget dwarf. What other kind of traditional Sherlockians do object to, though, because some of them have such a great love of chronology, is in some ways how the film kind of mixes and matches and confuses some of the chronologies. Mary Morstan, she's out of the sign of four. Their meeting in the restaurant is a non-canonical kind of occurrence. There are some other instances where the kind of traditional chronologies, the way Sherlockians have thought about them, are twisted, or stories are mixed and matched. And that's fine. The Irene Adler character, Rachel McAdams character. I mean, she's in Scandal in Bohemia in the original stories, and you hear echoes of her as the woman, the only I think man or woman really to best Sherlock Holmes, and so Guy Ritchie and the writers have more fun with that character as well in this film.
What else do you like about this movie? Like, we like the casting. How do we feel about this movie? How is this movie different, or what do you like? What does this movie bring to the Sherlock Holmes world that we haven't seen before?
It's interesting in that it brings an element of the supernatural, which occasionally pops up in the original canon. In fact, I think one of the stories, I don't think if it's the Hound of the Baskervilles or one of the others, Holmes has the line, "No ghosts need apply." And there's also this long legend that's read about the Hound, and don't go out on the moor at night when the powers of evil are exalted, that kind of thing. And so there are references, actually, when they're walking through an alleyway. I think it's when Watson's fortune is about to be taken. Watson is talking with Holmes about a supernatural angle to this case, and Holmes' reply is basically related to theories and data and the need for data and not having one thing twist the other. But part of the interesting thing for me, whenever the supernatural kind of pops up in a Holmes film like this, is Doyle's own interest in spiritualism, which occupied pretty much the last 2 or 3 decades of his life, in terms of his interests. I mean, he actually tired of writing the Sherlock Holmes stories fairly early on. I mean, the first one appears in 1887, and 6 years later, he's ready to kill him off. And then we don't get any Holmes stories for another 8 years, and it's not until The Hound comes out in 1902 that Holmes is reinvigorated. But in the meantime, as we get into the early 20th century, and I think especially because of the impact that World War I has on Doyle personally, things beyond the natural world, the supernatural, the spirit world, are of interest to him. And he devotes a lot of time. He goes on lecture tours around the world talking about spiritualism. He establishes a bookstore in London, the Spiritualist bookstore, and writes a number of books on spiritualism himself. So for me, it's this interesting kind of reverberation you get between how the supernatural manifests itself in any of the original canonical tales, or how it shows up in a movie like this where Watson is speculating, or even Blackwood's scripture references, which Holmes is very quick to pick up on from the Book of Revelation, which again points to something that's metaphysical. So I just find those instances intriguing and echoes of other things that either bring you back to Doyle's own experience as a person, as a writer, but also how they find their way into Guy Ritchie films.
Yeah, you don't have to travel far into this film to see like the religious overtones of this. And is that common of the writing of its era? Like when Doyle's writing this, is Sherlock Holmes radically different than what's coming out in the late 1800s out of England, or?
Well, it's interesting because okay, so 1887 is the first Holmes story, which includes this long Mormon interlude. Study in Scarlet has this long detour, some would say, into Mormon Utah and the American West. So there you've got religious overtones right from the get-go. But if you put it into context in terms of what's going on in Doyle's world, I mean, this gets us into a whole interesting discussion about Doyle himself, coming from a very strong Irish, English, Catholic, Scottish family. And Doyle basically rejects his Catholicism, which I think throws a lot of the other family members for a loop. Why is he doing this? We might, in more modern parlance, describe Doyle as a seeker. So he hasn't found an answer in the Catholicism that he's been raised in, and he looks elsewhere for answers, which is what ultimately brings him into the spiritualist universe. But you have other things happening. There are movements of what we would call free church movements happening in England and in Scandinavia. The English send Methodist missionaries basically to Stockholm in the 1880s, 1890s, and there's a whole kind of groundswell movement among the laity, kind of in reaction against the state church in Sweden. But I think you see that also happening in kind of the chapel movement, the nonconformist movement in late 19th, early 20th century English religious situation, which I'm less versed on. So, but there are things in that are, I think, swirling around Doyle of a religious nature that, as tuned in as he was to his time, he's going to pick up on some of those signals, and so I think it comes through in different stories. The solitary cyclist has a defrocked priest who performs a sham wedding. There are other instances, I think, of clergy making appearances. Holmes, actually, in Scandal Bohemia, Holmes is he's a convenient witness to a wedding of Irene Adler. um, so there are these little intersections of English ecclesiology, the church, that kind of do find their way into the stories, and they find their way into this film. You have religious protesters outside of Parliament with placards and signs, and they're protesting against Blackwood's resurrection, and that whole incident of Blackwood not dying in the original hanging and bursting forth from the tomb. You've got resurrection themes, you've got all kinds of so yeah, it's there, and Guy Ritchie takes advantage of it and uses it, threads it through. Even the order, I forget the name of the order. This interest in magic that fuels Blackwood's own campaign, but the order that it springs out of, and the fact that death has followed him, from the time of his birth, again gets us into those kind of metaphysical realms. Holmes' session where he's in that upper room, and he's dripping the wax on the floor and creating the pentagram and doing the diagrams and cutting his hand and bleeding, doing all those kind of ritual acts that are part of this magical order, again, are religious intrusions or interjections or threads that are part of the overall story that's being told. So I think for me, it works. Is it a historical expression of what's happening in Victorian England at the time? Maybe it's a little over the top, but I've got to think there were some of these kind of discussions and things going on in the established church and in the nonconformist church and in the laity. And it goes back to the Great Awakening and centuries earlier when you've got Wilberforce and discussions of slavery and all of that too. So,
do you have any beefs with this film?
well, I mentioned the chronological minor beef and the kind of mixing and matching of characters from different stories, which would be a minor beef as well, kind of ripping things out of canonical context. But do I have any beefs? Maybe, I don't know, how the police are depicted. I mean, and again, I think it's somewhat true to the echoes in the canon in terms of how Holmes views Scotland Yard, and you get that right at the beginning of the film, where Lestrade is busy mustering his forces while Watson and Holmes are taking care of business. But yeah, there's this depiction of the police force as inept or in some ways corrupt. If you've got Lestrade, maybe he's playing the role for Holmes, but he's open to the conspiracy of the order and lets the Home Office, the Home Secretary, know in kind of no uncertain terms by punching Holmes in the gut how he feels. Clarkey is the one member of the police that I kind of appreciate, because it seems like he's always kind of watching out for Holmes. He's the one that picks him up after that explosion, after Blackwood makes his getaway at the factory, and gets him, tells him that there's a warrant out for his arrest, and pushes him out of the way and kind of urges him to go into hiding. How are the police depicted? They're they're sitting in the cemetery, not willing to go down into the tomb to pick up the casket. So there's this kind of, I don't know, hesitancy. So maybe again a minor beef on how, and I don't know the history of the Metropolitan Police and the Bobbies, but they always seem to come off kind of on the short end in many Holmes films or depictions, somewhat by design because it's Holmes' own bias. I think there could be a little more justice done there. This is not a beef. It's actually, I think, something that kind of drew me to the film originally. There's a bit of a steampunk kind of, not quite Wild Wild West kind of feel to it, but
awful fun. But yeah,
and again, I don't know in terms of the history of technology when radio waves really start to be, is that a stretch that device that's supposed to release chemical agent into Parliament could actually feasibly have come about? I mean, maybe Tesla and others were ahead of the game, and somebody like Moriarty could have figured it out. I don't know. So maybe that's a minor beef about how the technology gets portrayed. But I do like the kind of bit of steampunky feel, a bit of grit. I was rewatching the film a couple days ago, and I was curious about how innovative was the Tower Bridge and its construction, and and it was, and in some ways the bridge is another character in the film, plays a critical role.
Well, I mean, I think that's what's cool about this film, right? You get to the idea of the steampunk universe, and like this idea that radio is new and is something that has yet to be totally sussed out. You talk about the bridge, and it's thinking more deeply about this film. I think one of the cool things it does is it situates you 130 something years ago and says all of these things that we take for granted that are old now were once new and just beginning to be understood.
And not only new, but revolutionary. I mean, they were absolutely changing the face of the earth in terms of how people lived, how people worked, how people got around, how people communicated. You don't get the Dickensian sense of poverty, maybe.
No, because it's a modern city 130 years ago.
Right. It's a city. It's a city using the Chicago metaphor of broad shoulders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I meant to ask you. I was going to say the other thing you talk about the inspector Eddie Marsan, who I just freaking love. Like I see him in like everything that he comes up on, and it's terrific. We talk about Sherlock. We talk about Robert Downey Jr. And well, golly, this movie comes out in 2009, which is now 14 years ago.
Yep.
And of course, there's a sequel. We talked a little bit about this, and you started to talk a little bit about some of the other portrayals of Robert Downey Jr.
Of Sherlock.
Yeah, exactly. Of Sherlock. Can we talk a little bit about Sherlock Holmes in popular media, film, stage, television? Who do you like? Like, for somebody coming into Sherlock Holmes, can you give us a basic overview of like Sherlock Holmes through the time periods and what's our ups and downs here?
In some ways, that's a generational question too, because
Totally.
if I ask an older group, they're by and large going to say Basil Rathbone is their Sherlock.
That was my first Sherlock.
For me, the guy who brought me back into the fold, and when I applied for the job in Minnesota, Sherlock really wasn't on my radar. I had other collections that I knew about that I was looking forward to work with, and Sherlock was not one of them. But the guy who tuned me up in a way for walking into that position was Jeremy Brett. And the 10 years that he did the Granada series that was shown here on PBS Mystery, that was the first time, and I had read the stories as a kid, and I'd seen the Rathbone movies, most of them growing up. But that was the first Holmes that I had seen that had an edge. It was a Sherlock Holmes who was multidimensional, who was in some ways manic. Just a stunning portrayal of this very famous character. And it just drew me into, I had my VCR primed and ready to go every Thursday night when Mystery was on to record the next episode because I'd never seen anything like it. The thing is, I think you would, if you ask people much younger than me, they're going to say Benedict Cumberbatch or they're going to say Johnny Lee Miller. Johnny Lee Miller actually, I think, now holds the record for the most filmed instances of Sherlock Holmes, given I think they did 7 seasons of Elementary on CBS. So he holds the record. By the way, totally off topic for a second. If you have a chance, it was online for a while, and I hope it comes back. I think the National Theatre in London did Frankenstein, and the two actors, one portraying the monster, one portraying the doctor, were Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller.
Oh
And
wow.
they switched roles. So I watched both performances where, Cumberbatch is the monster in one and he's the doctor in the next, and Johnny Lee is vice versa. Absolutely amazing performances from both of them, just jaw dropping. So if you get a chance to watch that, do, because it is just crazy. But
I don't know if we give Johnny Lee Miller enough credit for being a really good actor. He's not quite as famous internationally. I mean, I guess maybe over the pond he is, but
and he's actually another one of my favorites, partly because of the pairing with Lucy Liu as Dr. Joan Watson. Again, the
yeah,
chemistry there
that was smart.
absolutely worked. But in a broader sense, to ask the question is to answer it by saying Holmes plays well in any medium at any time. You go back to the very beginning. William Gillette, an American actor, teams up with Conan Doyle. They start writing a play called Sherlock Holmes. Now, Doyle tires of the project, so basically hands the whole enterprise off to William Gillette. Gillette ends up portraying Holmes on stage in this play for the better part of a quarter century. Not only does he do it on stage, Gillette, by the way, you can visit his home. It's a Connecticut State Park now called Gillette Castle, and it's on my bucket list. I haven't visited, but I want to. Gillette takes that performance from the stage, and where does he go with it next? He takes it to silent movies. In 1916, there's a studio in Chicago, not far from where I used to live, called S&A Studio, and the building is still there. And they were filming silent movies actually in my neighborhood. There was a house in our neighborhood that was known as the Gloria Swanson house because it was used by her as a dressing room during some of the filming. But SNA does this silent movie with Gillette called Sherlock Holmes in 1916. Now, for decades after, the movie was thought to be lost because most silent movies, because they were on nitrate film, did not survive. It's an explosive, literally explosive medium. But about, I think now it's probably 7-8 years ago, a copy was found in a film vault in Paris, and they were able to restore it and digitize it. So now you can get your own copy of Gillette's 1916 Sherlock Holmes on DVD or Blu-ray. And then Gillette takes that another step. He takes the performance and Edith Meiser writes a script for him in 1930. This is towards the end of his career, but he does it on radio. So you go from print to stage to silent movies to radio, and then from there it goes to television. Well, you've got the talkies next. You've got Rathbone from 39, The Hound, which is maybe one of the most famous depictions. And then in some ways it gets a little convoluted because you've got Holmes fighting the Nazis and Sherlock Holmes goes to Washington and Woman in Green and all that other kind of stuff. But he does 14 films, and then it gets picked up in television in the 50s. Sidney Sheldon, I think it is, does a series. And there are also British. We can't forget, I'm terrible. My apologies. I always forget the British actors because there's Arthur Wantner. There are some stellar English actors who also do silent movies and early films. But then it goes on television. You get it in animation. You mentioned Great Mouse Detective. You've got anime. Sherlock Holmes is huge in Japan. The largest Sherlock Holmes fan club is in Japan. I think they've got over 2,000 members.
Wow. Are there Japanese productions or Japanese takes?
There
on
are, and
Sherlock?
in fact, and I'm apologies here. I don't remember her name, but I think she's a Japanese actress who portrays a female Sherlock Holmes. Sadly, I think she died unexpectedly, and they'd only gotten in a season of the show. So you have both male and female. You have, and Holmes and Watson, the fanfic on platforms like Archive Our Own, where the relationships are the ships, all the different pairings, all kinds of amazing creative work done. So this is a character. Both Holmes and Watson are characters that play well in any medium over the whole time frame. And some of these things come back. Clive Merrison, BBC did a whole remake of the canon on radio, which is just stellar. Stephen Fry, I think, did an audio book maybe of the entire canon. And Stephen's I'd love to meet him someday because, he shows up as Mycroft in the second Robert Downey Jr. film, Sherlock's older brother. But Stephen is also a patron of arguably the other collection that maybe rivals us in terms of size, the Richard Lancelin Green Bequest, the Portsmouth City Library Museum and Archives. It's another jaw-dropping collection. Richard Lancelin Green was a phenomenal Sherlockian collector. His interest in Holmes goes back to, I think, when he was at the age of 12. And in the family home, he was allowed to create a sitting room, I think, up on the upper levels of the home. Now, granted, this is a home, the Lancelin Green family goes back to the Norman Conquest, and they've been on the same place for 900 or so, maybe 1,000 years now. Richard's father, Richard and Roger both have Oxford connections, but his father was a student of J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and a good friend of Lewis. In fact, Richard's mother and father took Lewis and Lewis's wife, Joy, on a trip to Greece toward the end of Lewis's life. But Richard's collection, Richard sadly died way before his time. I think he was 51 when he passed under trying circumstances. But his collection was bequeathed to the city of Portsmouth. I've had a chance to visit and work in it a couple times. But Richard has a lot more on Doyle than we do, and a lot of movie stuff, movie posters. He's got Jeremy Brett's passport or driver's. I forget how he managed to
Oh,
get
that's very
that, but
cool.
so yeah. Anyway, long answer short. Holmes plays well in any medium over any time, and so many people have had the chance to portray him, including Robert Downey Jr.
Do you like the Henry Cavill, the Enola Holmes series? How do you feel about this?
I do, and kudos to Nancy Springer for creating Enola, because again, I think she's a fascinating character. There's another author too who's, speaking of steampunk and
Mhm.
women. I think I'm blanking again on her name. I think her last name is Gleason, but she's done a couple of books where you have Sherlock Holmes' niece and Bram Stoker's daughter team up together in kind of a steampunk London, and that has echoes of kind of Neil Gaiman and Neverwhere kind of to it. And I like Enola. I've the two films that have come out have been a lot of fun, and that Sherlock gets us a little closer in age, maybe to somebody you can think of who's just recently come out of university. On the other hand, the Mycroft in those movies is not fat, and Mycroft is supposed to be fat.
All right, I gotta ask you. You said plays well in any medium. Are we including the Will Ferrell, John C. Reilly film?
I will be honest with you, and that is one movie I have not seen.
You don't
I
want to.
will see it at some point. A Sherlockian friend of mine from Illinois absolutely loves the movie, and I don't know how many times he's watched it. I will watch it. The trailers, the stuff, the clips that I saw, just kind of left me.
It's a bit. It's a different take, and you should watch it for scholarly purposes.
I want to see Queen Victoria get whacked by a camera tripod.
All right, let me ask you this. Okay, we've had all this opportunity to talk about, because I know that with originally this film, with the Guy Ritchie film, the initial idea was to make it a young Sherlock Holmes in the vein of a Batman Begins kind of thing. So if you were, and we're starting this new thing dedicated to a former AHA president called The Sweetest Thing, which is bringing this all the way to the present. Let's talk about historical presentism. If you can make a Sherlock Holmes film, is there a story that you would want to see? And if so, who would you cast?
Well, it kind of relates to a question often asked in Sherlockian circles in terms of the 60, what's your favorite story? And for me, my favorite story is the Bruce Partington plans, in part because it involves espionage, spies, stolen submarine designs, and I'm kind of a submarine nut a little bit on the side. So if I was going to make a new Sherlock Holmes movie, that would be the framework I would use. If I could cast Matt Damon, as a youngster instead
Like
of
a
Matt
Goodwill
Damon.
Hunting era Matt Damon?
Yeah, that kind of era Matt Damon instead of, I mean, I liked him in the Bourne stuff, but he's too old. And so I'm kind of racking my brain. For some reason, Daniel Radcliffe pops to mind, but even Daniel's too old now. If you could have caught him kind of in his later Harry Potter phase, that might have worked. So yeah, who are the young, and it doesn't have to be male actors. It could be female. Who's out there? I think if I would cast it, I would cast it as an African American or a British colonial, a person of color, because one of the faults of the Sherlockian world in general is it's,
Mm-hmm.
and this is for fandom, except for more recent fandom. The older kind of devotee fandom is white through and through.
Right.
There are very very few people of color or people of various gender identities. So I would do the Bruce Partington plans, and I would cast the lead characters as people of color.
Do they have to be British?
No, actually, what would be kind of intriguing is take a British colony in
Say
the
India.
yeah, either the subcontinent, or I was thinking somewhere in the Caribbean, and cast it that way. Now, again, traditional Sherlockians are say you can't do any film unless it's in the Victorian or Edwardian period. If it's that's why they didn't like Johnny Lee Miller and Lucy Liu, because it's in modern day New York City, and that just violates their sensibilities entirely. For me, it would matter less whether it's Victorian, Edwardian, or present day. I think you could do a really interesting present day Bruce Partington plans cast in Mumbai.
There's another Sherlock Holmes I keep thinking of, and his name is Bruce Wayne. And I'm not kidding on this because I think that Bruce Wayne and Robin, you've got some direct correlation there. Is there stuff written on the correlation between Batman and Sherlock?
Yeah, there are some interesting crossovers. In fact, I don't know if it's still sitting near my desk, but for a while I had a comic book that had Sherlock Holmes and the Joker on the cover. So there are Sherlock Batman crossovers. There are Sherlock Star Trek crossovers. You got Data on the holodeck and Geordi doing Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Spock occasionally quotes directly from the canon. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable must be the truth.
That's Sherlock.
That's Sherlock. That's straight out of canon. Yeah. So yeah, those crossovers are interesting. I think there are Doctor Who Sherlock crossovers, which is also interesting because the guys who did the BBC Sherlock also did Doctor Who, Stephen Moffat, and why am I terrible on names today?
Because you said approximately 700 of them. You've given us like every Sherlock
well,
and then apologize for the one person you couldn't recall.
Well, there's a guy out in the Sherlockian world here. I think his name's Howard Ostrom, who keeps a database of people who have portrayed Sherlock Holmes, and it could be amateur theater, it could be mainline cinema, it could be me putting on my Deerstalker.
There you go. That was prohibited in this film, though, right? The Deerstalker was prohibited, so was the elementary bit, right? You don't see either of those in this film.
And elementary, my dear Watson, that phrase does not appear in the canon. Elementary and my dear Watson appear separately, but they're never combined. I think it's the actor William Gillette who combines those two in the play Sherlock Holmes, Elementary, my dear Watson.
And then it becomes ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things to me is that we've lived with Holmes as a character, and some would say as a real person, for so long that he has become iconic in the true sense of the word icon. You see a Deerstalker hat, who do you think of? Sherlock Holmes. You see a meerschaum pipe, who do you think of? Sherlock Holmes. You see a magnifying glass, who do you think of? Sherlock Holmes. Now, in a lesser extent, if you throw in the Inverness Cape, then you've got the full meal deal with all the pieces of the icon there. And so he has become so ingrained. And what's interesting about the Deerstalker, it's not mentioned in the original stories either. It's an artist. It's Sidney Paget, the artist who does the illustrations in the original Strand magazine stories where they appear, who has this amazing illustration of Holmes and Watson. They're in a railroad carriage. Because the Deerstalker is a hat for the country. It's not you don't wear it in the city, but Holmes has got the Deerstalker, and they're leaning into each other on opposite sides of this railroad carriage, obviously in intense discussion. And it's Paget who introduces that bit into the iconography. In the stories itself, Holmes is described as wearing maybe a cloth cap or a top hat, but you don't get any more descriptive than that. In the same way, he's as likely to be smoking cigarettes or cigars as he has a pipe. And if he's smoking a pipe, it could be a long churchwarden, it could be a clay pipe. The dropped meerschaum pipe is another William Gillette invention, because Gillette wanted a pipe that didn't interfere with his profile when he's on stage performing. He wanted people to see his face, and the only way he could do that is come up with this dropped meerschaum pipe. But again, it's part of the icon now.
Well, I got another part of the icon I have to ask you about, and this is the thing I just remembered. Cocaine. What's up with
a 7% solution? And here's another interesting crossover. Nicholas Meyer does a book, The 7% Solution, that also gets made into a film. Nicholas Meyer also directs Wrath of Khan, and he's written a couple Sherlock novels as well. And I've had a
Benedict
chance.
Cumberbatch later performs as Khan.
Yeah. So the drugs are in the original stories, whether it's cocaine, opium, whatever. And Doyle, as a practicing physician in Victorian England, is going to have these things readily available to use in therapies and treatment. They're not criminalized at this point.
No.
They're part of regular medical care. Laudanum, cocaine, opium. They're all there in the doctor's toolkit, as it were, to use to treat patients. And
is this why we call Victorian England the good old days?
Yeah, maybe.
Sorry, go on.
Holmes' innovation with the cocaine is it's a 7% solution. So it's not straight. It's diluted in some way. But this is one of Watson's kind of constant laments, is because Holmes frequents opium dens to gain intelligence as he's working on a case, or he relies on cocaine when he doesn't have a case, because he describes his mind as an engine that's just constantly running, and it's going to just burst apart if it doesn't have something to. And cocaine is that bridge between one case and another to kind of get him through.
Isn't Doyle onto something here, though, in the late 1800s, where if he's really kind of talking about that? Because what we've seen in a lot of research now is things like psilocybins. Obviously, we see marijuana as this incredible, drug. But we see in a lot of cases what has been considered by Western medicine, or as Western science, is actually medicine in a lot of different communities. It's kind of uncanny.
Yeah, Doyle is into a whole bunch of stuff, not only on the medical front. And you have to realize he actually wanted to transition to be an ophthalmologist, and then realized he could make more money just writing straight. So he pretty much jettisoned his medical career. But not only is he doing this stuff with his familiarity with medicine, is he's also designing body armor and proposing designs to the Ministry of Defense. They turn it down, but he's got a design. He sketches it out. He's got a plan to put a tunnel underneath the English Channel, way ahead of his time. Now we've got the Channel as a quick transportation link between England and the continent. He warns in a short story about the dangers of submarine warfare prior to the war, and that England can be cut off, can be starved if submarine warfare takes place around the British Isles. And again, he's out in front. So he is a very fascinating character. And plus, he may have been the first goalie for the football team in Portsmouth, what we would call soccer. I mean, and he plays cricket. He's on a cricket team with some of his teammates are folks like J.M. Barrie and P.G. Woodhouse. And so he's athletic. He introduces, or he's one of the very first Englishmen to learn how to ski. He's in Switzerland because his first wife has tuberculosis, and that's the place to go if you want to breathe some good air. And while he's there, he learns how to ski. So he's a judge in one of the Olympics, and actually gets reprimanded because he helps along a runner who's in distress. He's a very fascinating character, and he's got storytelling. It's in its blood. He grew up listening to his mom tell stories, and it's kind of part of this Irish, Scottish, English upbringing that he's a natural storyteller. And what we forget is Holmes is just one part of his literary output. He writes historical fiction. He writes straight history. He does a history of the Boer War, and that's really what gives him his knighthood, and why we call him Sir Arthur.
Really?
Yeah.
Boer War is fascinating to me.
He actually goes down, serves in a private hospital, field hospital in the Boer War, and it's on his way back from South Africa that he happens to meet this journalist on board ship a guy by the name of Fletcher Robinson, and the two of them start talking about country legends involving ominous-looking dogs. And when they get back to England, they go on a little multi-week golfing, hiking trip and gather information about these country legends. And it's Fletcher Robinson that Doyle credits for the idea behind The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is probably the most famous of the Sherlock Holmes stories. So, I mean, yeah, Doyle is just, he's a very intriguing person. Doesn't get enough credit for, he writes poetry, he's history. He's got a whole other series involving Brigadier Gerard in the Napoleonic era that runs to multiple stories too. I forget how many of those Brigadier Gerard stories he writes. So this is a guy that's immensely creative. And on top of it all, he also rescues a couple of guys in real life who are legally charged by doing something that they didn't do. And Doyle takes his best Sherlock Holmes methodology to the cases and basically gets the decisions overturned.
Tim, I don't want another Sherlock Holmes film. I want an Arthur Conan Doyle biopic. Have we seen one of those yet?
I think there have actually been a couple attempts. There's a real intriguing little clip from I think it's 1927, a newsreel that you can hear Doyle in real life. He talks about spiritualism. He talks about Sherlock Holmes. Hold on a second. My wife is yelling at me. We might have to edit this part out.
Go ahead. No, that's fine.
I'm on my podcast.
Fletcher, go ahead and keep the yelling at Tim in the podcast. That'll be great. So, yeah, we'll just go ahead and
I'm back.
Fletcher, don't you
She
dare.
forgot I was doing the podcast, so she's yelling at me, I think.
I see how it is.
Sorry about that. I hope we can edit that out, or you can keep it.
No
whatever.
Way. We'll do it over. We're keeping the bar low here. No, I want like a Netflix series on this dude. That's what I'm imagining right now.
There was a series. Ian Richardson played Joseph Bell, who was a professor in Edinburgh that Doyle had in medical school. I forget the name of the series. It's something like Dark Mysteries or something like that. They all take place in Edinburgh. And Conan Doyle is a student assistant, and they're out solving mysteries. I'm sure there's a Doyle biopic out there. I'm drawing a blank on who might have done it.
Oh, I'm casting him right now. I want Joel Edgerton as Arthur Conan Doyle. That's who I want. I want Joel Edgerton in every film. Him and Sam Rockwell. But all right, I don't want to get you late for dinner. So let me ask you the big important question tonight.
All right.
Is Sherlock Holmes a history film?
Yes. It's a history film because you are placed in historical contexts. You have echoes of Guy Fawkes and the blowing up of Parliament. You have Parliament. You have London as a world-class city on the rise with emerging technologies. You have figures that, while they may be characters in the film, find echoes in historical characters, whether they're active in Parliament or law enforcement or science or architecture or you name it, because London and environs are in many ways the center of the universe at that particular point in time. So yeah, it's a historical film because it's also a launching pad to do historical investigations into, like I was saying at the beginning, I got intrigued with the history of Tower Bridge and how innovative was that as an architectural structure and suspension bridge. So I'm down the rabbit hole on the history of architecture. So it's a history film because it opens so many doors to the history of a fascinating time in Victorian England.
Awesome. Tim, where can people open the door to find more about you?
They can find me at the University of Minnesota Libraries. There's a link under the main library's webpage, a staff directory, where you can find my contact information. You can also there's a link there to my portfolio, so you can see some of my publications, some of the positions I've held professionally. And there's also a web page, kind of bare bones right now because we've migrated to a new platform, but a page for the Sherlock Holmes collections themselves, so you can find some things there. There's also a thing called the U Media Archive, and you can dive into that from the Sherlock Holmes page or from the library's main page. That'll take you to some of the digitized things we've put up. I think we've got 12 or 1,500 items up there, including some audio recordings. So if you want to hear John Bennett Shaw talk about the cult of Sherlock Holmes, that recording is there. So that's where you can find me. At one of the amazing libraries in North America, the University of Minnesota Libraries.
I love our library system at the University of Minnesota. I love the university. I'll get all that stuff put on there. And one of my favorite things about Minnesota was that it gave me our friendship, Tim. Like, I bumped into you, like people don't know, we bumped into each other just hanging around the library one day, just started talking over for God knows what.
It was the exhibit gallery on the first floor of Anderson. You were in there looking at an exhibit. I forget which one it was. And we just started chatting. And as they say, the rest is history.
All right, man. Thank you so much for being on.
Buddy, this has been fun. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
And that's a wrap to our detective story today. Thank you so much to our guest, Tim Johnson, for joining in. You can find him on Twitter at UMN Bookworm, or you can find him perusing the stacks in Minneapolis, or perhaps wading a stream somewhere in Colorado or Minnesota with a fly rod in his hand. Tim's the best dude, so make sure you follow him along. He's just the best guy. I hope you guys dug this pod. Thank you, of course, to the Watson to my Sherlock. I don't know. To Fletcher Powell for producing this podcast. Thank you so much. And guys, thank you all for continuing to be here. The numbers on this pod continuing to go up every single week, and it's only because you guys are continuing to share this with your friends, with the enemies, with your Moriartys of the world, telling them about this podcast. Thank you guys so much for continuing to post this on Twitter, on Blue Sky, on Facebook, for leaving comments. And if you haven't done so yet, please do so, or at least consider doing so, and leave a nice one, because it really does help with the algorithms and for us to push this pod. So thank you so very much. And we've got a ton of really cool podcasts coming up for you guys soon. Off the top of my head, we've got Dirty Dancing, we've got Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, we've got Last of the Mohicans coming up. We've got just a bunch of stuff coming for you guys, so I hope you really dig it. Thank you again so much for being here and being part of this community. So, one other thing. If you haven't made plans, be in Denver on November 11th, because Kathleen Ballou and I are going to be doing a live podcast of the film Red Dawn at the Society for United States Intellectual History Conference in Denver on November 11th. It's going to be at Wynkoop Brewery, so make sure that you are there. It's going to be an absolute blast. Me and Kathleen are just going to go. Actually, just got a text from her just now. So, you guys, can't wait to see you in person in Denver on November 11th. So, can't wait to see you, and we will talk to you soon. Ciao for now. Bye.